Okay, so let's go back to 2008. Kosovo declares independence from Serbia. And this was, a hugely controversial move. It split the world right down the middle. But the big question was it actually legal? That question, well, it went all the way to the top, to the International Court of Justice, the world's highest court, to get a final, definitive answer.
Right. So the UN General Assembly didn't just ask, hey, is this legal? Nope. They sent this super precise, really technical question to the court. And I want you to pay close attention to the wording here. By the Provisional Institutions of Self-Government of Kosovo. Now that might sound like a bunch of legalese, but trust me, those specific words, they're going to become the absolute key to this entire case.
And here's the answer they came back with. And it was a total bombshell. In 2010, the court's final conclusion was that the Declaration of Independence did not violate international law. Yeah, you heard that right. For a lot of people, this was a stunning outcome. And it leaves us with this massive question that's going to drive the rest of our explainer. How on earth did they reach that conclusion?
So to really get the court's logic, we've got to do a super quick history lesson. Let's rewind to 1999. The UN Security Council passes Resolution 1244. This basically puts Kosovo under a temporary international administration. Fast forward to 2007, and years of talks about its final status have just hit a dead end. Total deadlock. And that deadlock is what directly leads to the Declaration of Independence in 2008, which then kicks off this whole process with the court's opinion in 2010.
Okay, and this is a really important point. You've got to understand just how narrow the court's job was here. They weren't asked to rule on whether Kosovo was now a state. They weren't asked if it had a right to secede. And they definitely were ruling on what happens when other countries recognize it. The only question on the table was a super technical one. Was the simple act of declaring independence against the law? It's a subtle distinction, but as you'll see, it's absolutely crucial.
So how did the court tackle this? Well, they were really methodical. They broke their investigation down into two main steps. First, they asked, let's look at general international law. Just in general, is there any kind of universal rule out there that says a group can't declare independence? And second, they looked at what's called the lex specialis. That's just fancy Latin for the specific law. In this case, that meant the UN framework, especially Resolution 1244, that applied only to Kosovo.
Now, the main argument against the declaration was this big principle called territorial integrity. It's a cornerstone of international law, right? It basically says countries shouldn't mess with other countries' borders. But here's where the court made a really critical distinction. They said, wait a minute, that principle is all about relations between states. The real question was, does it apply to a group inside a state? That's a whole different ballgame. So, the court looked back through centuries of history, how states have behaved, and they came to their first big conclusion. And it was crystal clear. General international law has no rule that prohibits declarations of independence. Let me say that again. Looking at the whole world, there was simply no law on the books that made the act of declaring independence illegal. Period. But hold on, that was just step one of their investigation. That brings us to part two, the much trickier question. Was Kosovo a special case? Did the UN's own rules, specifically for Kosovo, forbid a declaration? This is where the real legal detective work starts.
And the entire case, all the analysis of UN resolutions, it all boiled down to one single fascinating detail, a question that would decide everything. Who actually made the declaration? Were these people an official government body? Or were they something else?
And this is where the court's argument gets really clever and honestly brilliant. They laid out two possibilities. Possibility one, the declaration was made by the Provisional Institutions of Self-Government. That's the official body the UN set up. If that's who they were, well, they were bound by the UN's rules, and those rules said they couldn't decide Kosovo's final status. Game over. But the court said, what if they were acting as something else? What if they were acting as the representatives of the people of Kosovo, a group outside that official UN framework? Well, then, those UN rules just wouldn't apply to them.
So how did the court figure out which one it was? They looked at the evidence piece by piece. First, the language. The document says, we, the democratically elected leaders of our people, not the official title, Assembly of Kosovo. Then the signatures. It was signed by people who weren't even in the assembly, like the president. And then there's the procedure. It wasn't published in the official gazette, which was a requirement for any official law. But maybe the biggest tell of all? The UN's top representative there, the one person who had the power to annul any official act he thought was illegal, he did nothing. Just silence.
Okay, so let's put all those pieces together and see the final picture. The court's logic goes like this. Step 1. There's no general ban on declaring independence. Step 2. The people who wrote this declaration were acting outside the official UN-created government. Step 3. Because they were acting outside that system, they weren't bound by its rules. And that means the declaration didn't violate UN Resolution 1244. And the bottom line, the final conclusion, the declaration did not violate any applicable rule of international law. But here's the crucial takeaway, and you really got to get this. The court was incredibly careful not to create a right to secede. All they said was that in this very specific case, no specific law was broken. And think about it. There's a huge difference between something not being against the law and something being a right given to you by the law. The court only ruled on the first part of that.
And all of this leaves us with one last really fascinating question to think about. I mean, the court's opinion was a masterclass in legal navigation, right? They steered through a political minefield using just careful technical reasoning. But in doing that, they lit up this huge gray area in the rules that govern our entire world. So what does it really mean for international order when a major political act like this is found to be neither illegal nor explicitly legal, but to exist in that foggy space right in between?